Good afternoon and welcome to the STI Summit. It's the first day of our summit. We're broadcasting here from Geneva, and the Sustainable Development Impact Summit is now going to take place in the forthcoming days. And at opening day, we have a great panel here today with us looking at how we can make sure that the recovery that we are now seeing is more inclusive and sustainable and job creating than what we saw before the pandemic. But let's face it, we're not out of the woods yet. We know that COVID-19 is still around. We know that many economies will be back by the end of this year in a pre-COVID level, but many economies will only recover back to pre-COVID level in 2023 and 24. And there are challenges. There is inflation. There is also, of course, now a situation where a lot of the fiscal muscles are used. We put $13 trillion on the table. So if we're going to achieve also progress in the years to come, we really need public-private partnerships and initiatives and collaboration, because many governments will not have the necessary fiscal muscles. The great panel here, as I mentioned, we have Mohammed Al-Jadaan. He's the finance minister of Saudi Arabia. We have Vicky Holub. She is the president and CEO of Occidental. We have N.K. Singh, and N.K. is one of the experienced leaders from India and currently the chairman of Finance Commission of India. We have Rich Lesser. He is the CEO of BCG, Boston Consulting Group, and taking over as the chair now in October. And we have George Oliver, chairman and CEO of Johnson Controls. So this is going to be a very important discussion now at the first day of our summit. Let me go first to you, Minister Al-Jadaan. You also headed the successful G20 presidency on behalf of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And you were also focusing on the developing countries that are now in quite a vulnerable situation post or following the pandemic. At the same time, we are now focusing on how making sure that this recovery will be more inclusive and sustainable. So it would be interesting to hear from you, Minister, at the start here. How optimistic are you about the recovery? When is it really going to happen? Are we going to run out of speed when the money that we put on the table now for stimulus is running out? And how can we walk the talk, making sure that we secure more inclusiveness, sustainability, and jobs for the young people following the pandemic? Over to you in Riyadh, and thank you for joining.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the fantastic panel in front of me. Borge, I think you mentioned a couple of very important points. And to start with, and to answer the question very directly, I am optimistic. And I think, yes, we will have overall globally a very healthy recovery. That said, it is not going to be equal recovery, and it is not going to be equitable recovery. There are a lot of issues that we need to deal with, and we need to learn from the pandemic. The pandemic told us very clearly that if we don't fix the world, you are not safe in an individual country. And if you look at the emerging markets, their opportunity for a sustainable growth and the very few years to come are going to be very difficult and challenging without dealing with the pandemic. And we need really to focus on fighting the pandemic, bringing our kids to school, because that will really bring them back and compensate for the lost opportunities. A lot of kids around the world, like in Saudi Arabia, people in the third grade today have only been in school for possibly 2 or 3 months in the last 2 years. We are now back to school, and I think it is an area where we need to focus. So it brings a very clear signal that the world is back and is recovering. But also we need to focus on equitable distribution of vaccines. And that is a very serious area where governments and private sector will need to come together to make sure that we deal with the bottlenecks of vaccine production and allow the emerging markets who does not have access to vaccines to be given that opportunity. I think we also need to deal with as another lesson learned from this crisis is that you cannot have one-size-fits-all solutions. You need to deal with countries' specific circumstances and really, really focus on that. We need to continue the efforts that G20 have endorsed last year in terms of the DSSI, in terms of the framework, the common framework, and dealing with sustainable debts at low-income countries. That's an area where we really need to focus on. We need to get the private sector also participate. And I will close, Jorge, very specifically on the circular carbon economy and the issues that possibly even before we started in the background of this discussion, renewables are a great thing to have, and I could tell you, even though we are the most possible producers and exporters of oil, we are focusing on renewables, but renewables is not the only solution. I think we need to focus and invest in technologies, research and development, and carbon capture, reuse, so that we deal with it at a very wide level. Thank you, Jorge.
No, thank you, Minister. I think this is a great segue into also Vicky Holub, CEO and President of Occidental. You heard the Minister talking about renewables, of course, but also having a bridge between today's energy mix and the future energy mix. At the same time, we know that there are close to 800 million people in the world that doesn't even have access to basic electricity. So how do we square this circle moving forward?
Well, first of all, let me say I'm glad to be a part of this forum because it's forums like this that are going to help us advance to where we need to be. And certainly where we need to be in the world is to provide low-cost electricity for those places in the world that don't have it right now. We need to get a better balance across all of the world for quality of life. And for quality of life, certainly electricity power is going to be necessary, but it has to be an affordable cost of energy. So to me, that puts the pressure on the rest of us around the world to do the things that we need to do, especially in the developed economies, with the U.S. being a specific focus for this, is to develop and help the transition out of fossil fuels by using technologies that help not only prevent emissions from existing sources, but to also remove CO2 from the air. Because there's no doubt that we're going to need fossil fuels for a long time to come, and longer than most people think, because fossil fuels will help to generate the low-cost power for some of those places that don't have it today. So without a way to prevent the emissions happening from industrial sources in the developed economies today, and without the ability to take CO2 directly from the air, we can't make that happen. And so what we're trying to promote here at Occidental is this collaboration that's been talked about now in the film and from the minister, this collaboration that's so necessary for our world to get to where we need to be. And all we have to do is look at the incentives that were given to solar, wind, and electric vehicles to see the case study for how to make that happen. And so I think that for the developing world and for those areas that most need it, we have to accelerate what we're doing with respect to CCUS. Also, as the minister suggested, CCUS has to happen in a big way. Direct air capture has to happen. And collaborating among sectors and getting more companies involved in this is going to help us get there. And I'm really optimistic because there are a lot more companies that are starting to show interest in doing this proactively without mandates from governments, because the mandates won't get us there as fast as we need to get there. So it's the companies that are committing to become net zero by either 2040 or 2050. They're the drivers of what's going to be most important for the world to reduce the emissions from where they are today, while not impairing those people that don't have the lower cost electricity that will provide a quality of life that the rest of us enjoy.
Well, thank you so much. Rich Lesser, the CEO of BCG. I know a lot of companies now do come to you to get advice. They want to go then CO2 neutral by 2030 or 2050. You listen to what Minister Ajadan said, also what the CEO of Occidental now underlined, that also carbon has to be part of the solution, but then we also need new technology. How do you see the energy mix and the opportunities then for a decoupling here between growth in energy consumption and CO2 emission?
So, well, first, I would agree with Vicky. It's wonderful to get a group together to talk about these issues that span the public and private sector, because we need cooperation across all sectors if we're going to make the progress that we need. I just highlight a few things. The first is the encouraging. There's two levels of encouragement that I would observe right now amidst massive challenge, which I do not want to diminish. The first is how much this has risen on the agenda of nearly every leader I talk to, whether in the public or in the private sector. It's not that this was unimportant 3 years ago or 5 years ago, but one would have thought while we're still sort of wrestling with a pandemic in many parts of the world, this might have fallen off the radar screen, and it's just the opposite. For so many leaders, this is now one of the 3 or 4 core priorities that they're thinking about for their businesses looking ahead. The second thing, from direct observation that we've had the privilege to have with now hundreds of clients, is the opportunity to go further than people think they can in economically viable ways. I think many leaders started with the sense it's the right thing to do, but there's no way it's affordable to do. And it is true for most businesses. To go all the way to net zero today is extraordinarily expensive. That last 20 to 40% of carbon that sits in a business is really hard to pull out. But what's very encouraging is the degree for many businesses to get 40 to 70% out relatively quickly, and either in economically neutral to slightly positive ways, and sometimes to actually make it so that you can then afford to take on the really hard parts. I think people are realizing they can go further faster than they thought, and that's a really good sign. At the same time, the challenges are immense. First of all, 40 to 70% reductions aren't sufficient. We need to be getting as close to net zero as we can, as fast as we can. And in order to get that last chunk out, we will need a combination of technology, incentives, collaboration across sectors in order to drive that. Second, for most businesses, excluding the really upstream sectors like steel or aviation or aluminum, most sectors have most of their carbon emissions not inside their own operations, but in the operations of their upstream business partners, their scope 3 in the parlance of carbon language. And that requires tremendous operational skill to put the right measures in, to change the way we work with all our business partners, to have procurement weigh different things in the choices of who it works with and the incentives it sends to be able to do that. And the final point is, for many parts of the world, the kind of transition we need is just not affordable, given all the other pressures they have to bring people out of poverty, to deal with immense near-term challenges. And in order to do that well, we need the developed world to step up more, to deliver on the $100 billion that was in the Paris Accords but has not really come through. We need better collaboration across country boundaries and better support. And we need to make sure that we're sending signals that we have to work together to make it a just transition at both the macro level in terms of flowing resources to those parts of the world, and at the micro level as individual companies take action that could harm communities, or not really bring people along in the kind of journeys that we need. So while there are signs of encouragement, we just have enormous challenges in order to make the progress at the speed we need to, given the urgency of this challenge.
Well, thank you so much, Rich. One company that is really walking the talk here in this area is Johnson Control CEO and Chairman George Oliver. The decarbonization that has to happen in the years to come also has to happen in our buildings. So maybe you can share your vision there, and how cost effective can it be? Can we make sure that the cost of inaction is then, I guess, higher than the cost of action in this field?
Yeah, Borge, and like Vicky and Rich, I really appreciate you including us on the panel. And I do believe that businesses play a huge role working with the public sector in making sure that we have an affordable supply of energy globally, that we drive economic development, and ultimately we decarbonize. And our view, as it relates to buildings, that you can do all of that. And we believe that decarbonization in the built environments, the role is a big role in shaping the economic recovery. So the transitioning to a lower carbon economy, we believe, is an opportunity to build back better as we recover from the pandemic. Providing clean, sustainable, energy efficient solutions creates jobs while we're building strong, resilient global economies. And while we're doing that, it's important for us that we ensure all communities and workers benefit from the transition to a clean energy economy. And we believe, I agree with Rich, I think the forces that are underway and the way that this has come together to be a prioritization for all of our constituents is this year has been a critical year for climate action. Well, I think, as you have stated, science shows that we need to move faster to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And I believe, as Rich has said, that not only through incentives, but also the technologies that exist today, as well as being developed, I believe puts us solidly on a pathway to net zero by 2050. And now we know that decarbonization, when you look at buildings, is part of the solution, as buildings represent some 40% of global emissions, and reducing the energy waste from buildings not only saves money, but also there's every reason to accelerate action and to empower customers and future generations, ultimately to consume less energy, conserve resources, and identify pathways to achieve healthy net zero carbon buildings and communities. We talked a little bit about public-private partnerships and financing mechanisms, and I agree with Vicky. I believe the business community has an important responsibility to support ambitious climate change and policy and create jobs and economic growth, but we ultimately can't do it alone. We realize how important it is to collaborate with all of our stakeholders in the public and private sectors. And we believe global policies funding, incentivizing, and directly mandating decarbonized buildings as a good example, which in the US, Biden's administration, their plan to retrofit all federal buildings and invest in broader decarbonization is a good example. And we're working with all of our stakeholders to ensure that we have a constructive path ahead of these actions. And one of the things I'd also note, Borge, is that as we're doing this, we're focusing on local communities that help them not only meet the decarbonization goals, but also ensure a sustainable recovery. A good example is projects like we did with the Housing Authority in the city of Pueblo, Colorado, where we've enabled decarbonization while ensuring an equitable recovery. With our partners, we actually built a solar garden for a housing authority that will generate enough energy to power 200 households annually. And in addition to providing the clean energy to the community, the project actually provided hands-on solar training and employment opportunities for the local community. And the improved building efficiencies will directly support the community wellness while reducing the city's carbon footprint to create a greener, healthier environment. So I think, 3 Ps, public-private partnerships, are an innovative model that can accelerate the implementation of these decarbonization measures by enabling the public sector to improve facilities without an upfront cost. And for us, we actually can create an economic return. We can go in, upgrade a building, make it healthier and safer, while we're reducing the energy consumed and ultimately delivering payback through operational improvement, because we can reduce it in operations 30, 40, 50%. And so we play a big role in reducing the demand at the same time that we're working with the supply to make sure that we're replacing the remaining demand with renewable supply that ultimately gets to a net zero carbon solution. So I believe that working the way that we're working and providing outputs and being able to bring a full solution within the building, connecting not only what we do in HVAC, but all of the other building systems, to connect all of that with automation. And then the data is what enables us to be able to have such a significant impact in the overall carbon consumed. So those are some of the thoughts that we have, and we've been on a journey working with the Business Roundtable, with in the US, with the European Roundtable, and with WEF to be able to educate all of our constituents on what ultimately can be achieved and can play a big part of how we not only create economic development at the same time while we're delivering on our decarbonization goals.
Thank you, George. Thank you for your leadership in this field. Let's then move to New Delhi. NK Singh is one of the most experienced civil servants, but also government leaders in India, and also happens to be an excellent economist. So I would like to pick your brain on some of the more macro challenges, NK, that we are faced with. We know that in the run-up to COP26 in Glasgow, we all know that without China and India on board, there will not be a new ambitious deal. And we know that Secretary Kerry just visited also India and discussed like when can there be, for example, an ambition from India's side to go net zero. At the same time, we know that the pandemic hit India in a rough way. You are now handling it. Economy is again growing quite substantially, but we know there's a lot of pressing development issues also facing your country. So how do you, what is your take on India's role now on the decarbonization and net zero global issue? And secondly, how do you see the next months when it comes to the Indian economy? Are you out of the woods?
Well, first of all, Borja, thank you so much. It's a privilege to be part of this discussion with such an eminent panelist, and most of what the other panelists have said, I'm in total agreement with them. I'll make some of the remarks very brief, but let me begin by saying that I agree with you about the fiscal muscle. I will comment on that issue of the fiscal muscle with which you began, but also with the remarks of the finance minister. He very sagaciously said that one size doesn't fit all. And India would be a classic case of one size not fitting all. This is because, as you rightly pointed out, that we have gone through successive waves of the pandemic. It has been a sagacious act on the part of the leadership to balance issues of life with issues of livelihood. The two are not symmetric. What may be good for life may or may not be good for livelihood. So a right mix in a manner which enables the life to be protected and minimizes human hardship, like direct benefit issues, like public distribution system being strengthened, like employment guarantee schemes for rural areas. And all that has resulted with a rather sharp, what I call a V-shaped recovery of the Indian economy, to take the last point which you mentioned. And I think that this recovery is likely to be sustainable. But before I comment anything on that sustainable, first of all, I totally agree with Vish that looking at COP26, the first dominant concern, and yes, Kerry was here, he met all the relevant interlocutors. Before that, the Environment Secretary Sharma was here. He met me also and discussed the stuff. So I think Rishi is absolutely right that the issue of the unfulfilled commitment of 100 billion seems to haunt us. And in some manner, this needs to be addressed, which addresses the historic legacy concerns of developing economies like India, of the huge amount of ozone layer already occupied, the issues of climate justice and so on. But I think that if we address this issue, we can get out of the trap of these legacy issues. Why? Because I totally agree that it is high up on the agenda. Never before has the issues been so high up. Never before has been such an enormous opportunity of making this economically viable and affordable. I think that in that sense, this COP26 is taking place in a much more favorable environment, notwithstanding the pandemic, than any other earlier COP, because the affordability and availability of technologies which make these commercially viable. I will make three very brief comments and stop. First, because technology is a great equalizer, but it's also a great divider, because as was rightly pointed out, that India coped with this huge pandemic. We did not allow our education systems to be disrupted because of online education for children, and yet, because of the lack of availability of electricity, a lot of people were left out of this mainstream, which accentuated the inequality in a country of India's size. I think that one of the questions which was posed was that have more people gone back into extreme poverty than ever before on account of the pandemic? And technology is a unifier, but technology can also be a divider. So I think as I look forward, how does one harness technology in a manner which makes it for Build Back Better, more inclusive, more equitable build back? And I think that some of the panelists who have pointed out on this have done. The second point, which I agree entirely, that we may have to live for fossil fuel for longer than we think. The issue would be, what is the most non-disruptive path as we embrace the renewable technology? Now, we need to have a combination of the two. A lot of livelihood, a lot of human life has been built around fossil fuel. And as we transit to an era of renewable fuels, transit to an era of green fuels, we need to see the least disruptive part, which is for a large country of 1.2 billion size of India, difficult. One last point, and I'll stop. I entirely agree with you, Boshe, that whereas public outlay is important, and that's where I think that some of the support from multilateral organizations and the World Bank, the IMF, what has been done by way of public outlays, this additional finance is important. But we need to find way of how does one crowd in private capital. Now, some of India's leading firms, some of which the Excellency Finance Minister may be aware of, have taken some far-reaching steps in risky, large investments on green hydrogen energy, on storage systems, on transportation systems. And how does the regulatory framework in our countries begin to crowd in private investment? And a lot of the success of COP26 will depend on the ability to harmonize a relationship between public-private partnership, which is mutually beneficial. Thank you, Boshe.
No, thank you so much, NK. Extremely important input. I would like to go back to you, Minister Jadon. You heard NK sing here talking about the V-shaped recovery. Sometimes I feel we're like in a W-shaped recovery because of the pandemic. And as you also mentioned initially, it has not been a recovery that is distributed the same way all over the world. For example, on the stimulus, the 14 trillion US dollars, only 2% of the stimulus has gone to developing nations. And as we know, in the continent next to Saudi Arabia, Africa, only 2 to 3% of the population is vaccinated. And we have, for the first time in 2 decades, seen that there are now 100 million more people that became in the category of extreme poor this year. So the development issues are really, really challenging. At the same time, we know that climate change is also playing a role here. We have the run-up to the COP26, but at the same time, we know also there is energy poverty in the world, as I mentioned in my question to Vicky. So it is really a challenging landscape here, and how will the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia deal with this, and what's your policies now in the run-up to the COP26, the MC12, the trade minister meeting, and also the upcoming meetings in G20?
Thank you again. I was really pleased to hear my colleagues in the panel. I think they bring about very important points, particularly, Jorge, 2 key elements. One is, I think if we, possibly you said it before me, if we stop talking and do, I think we will achieve a lot more. I could tell you, in terms of recovery, it is possibly not necessarily V-shape or over, and not necessarily W or over, possibly even K-shape, where certain economies will pick up despite the difficulties, but others are going to struggle and struggle big time. In Saudi, I could tell you, while we have limited resources, we have contributed, when I compare just as Minister of Finance, how much I allocated to the vaccine in Saudi Arabia compared to how much we actually donated for the COVID-19, particularly for vaccine development and distribution. If you look at the size, it's about 20%. So we actually spent 20% supporting the world health recovery, particularly in the low-income countries, compared to how much I paid for vaccines in Saudi Arabia. And I think the second point, it's an argument that we had, if you remember, last year during our presidency and earlier this year with the G20 and then with the IMF, is for the special drawing rights. And I tried to lobby saying, actually, now we have an opportunity. So it is out of politics. You don't need to go to your parliament to allocate funds from your own budget. You will be given free money. So why are we giving it to countries and then expecting them to give it back to low-income countries? Why can't we allocate 50, 100, 150 billion out of the 650? And basically give it to the multilateral institutions and say, this is our insurance policy for low-income countries to recover. This is what we are going to do to help these countries. Unfortunately, that did not happen. I would still argue, and I'm encouraging my colleagues in the G20 to do something about this, and to make sure that we all, with the private sector, contribute to the equitable recovery out of this very difficult crisis. I would like to comment just on a couple of points, Jorge, that were mentioned before, and particularly in relation to energy. And in that point, I think we are possibly kidding ourselves if we think that clean energy is the solution in the short term and mid-term. Clean energy is very important, and renewables are extremely important. Saudi Arabia is actually investing tens of billions of dollars on renewables, and it is 50% of our energy mix, even though we are the most exporters of oil. But that alone is not going to be enough. And we have seen, and we should learn from what's happening in Europe today about the prices. We should literally learn that even electric vehicles, charging stations being stopped during the daytime because there isn't enough energy. So we need to work on research and development. We need to work on how we are going to develop technologies that would help us capture, reuse, or remove emissions.
Thank you. Vicky, you heard what Minister Jadon just said now on the energy prices. First, the price of oil and gas has gone up, and here in Europe, in the middle of Europe, we're seeing no electricity prices and gas prices we haven't seen for decades, and there is a lot of political pressure also on the leaders here. And at the same time, we know that we're running up to COP26. Are we currently seeing a global situation that there is a huge underinvesting in energy? Do you think we will have a energy security access crisis? And how do we deal with this at the same time as we have to get down the CO2 emissions? It seems like catch-22.
I definitely believe that's a risk, because if you look at the oil and gas industry and you look at the exploration that used to drive our industry in terms of developing new resources and finding new resources that can provide meet demand in the future, that exploration dollars are about 10% of what they were at the height of our industry. So exploration essentially is now a very, very, very small part of our industry investment. So without exploration, that means you have to get the most out of the reservoirs that you have today. And that's one of the premises of many models, is that the lower cost emissions will be those that come from existing reservoirs. And that will not only help to meet the growing challenge of meeting the world's future oil and gas demands with lower investment, it will also do it in a lower intensive way from an emission standpoint. And so that's why we're really pushing and trying to ensure that carbon capture, use, and sequestration is a part of the solution to what's happening with the energy industry today, the oil and gas industry. With fewer people developing new reserves, it's going to be critical that using carbon capture, use, and sequestration not only help us to generate and get more reserves out of the ground today. In fact, we can, in some cases, in these shale reservoirs, we can double recovery with CO2 enhanced oil recovery using anthropogenic CO2 from industry and CO2 directly from the air. And every time we cycle through CO2, a portion of that CO2, 40%, stays sequestered in the reservoirs. So it does help with sequestration. It also takes more CO2 injected into an oil reservoir than the barrel of oil that's produced from that injection generates when it's used. So combined with emission-free power, we can, and direct air capture, anthropogenic capture, the CCUS that we can do today will provide also lower carbon, net neutral or net zero carbon oil to aviation and maritime industries. And those are the industries that most need the help with becoming carbon neutral over time. So while I think that we're underinvested, I think that we have this very unique opportunity in the world that we can create more investment and generate the oil that the world needs, and while lowering emissions in the process, providing lower carbon or carbon neutral oil to aviation and maritime. And we're also developing a technology that goes along with that, which is an emission-free power generation technology. What it does is, as a part of the process of generating lower cost electricity than traditional ways that are used today, in producing that electricity generates a pure stream of CO2 that can then be sequestered without needing retrofitting. It's a part of the construction in the process, and it's called net power. So those are technologies that need to be advanced in lieu of spending a lot more dollars to go and explore and develop new reserves in the world. And so we're doing that, and I know others are looking at doing that too. And I think that's how our industry helps with the transition.
Well, thank you so much. Rich Lesser, we really need someone as thoughtful as you and BCG to help us here now, because I, in a way, see a triangle here. It's access to energy, then there is energy security, But then there is the question of like all this energy also has to be decoupled from increased CO2 emissions, or we have to have the technology of carbon capture, storage, and sequestration. But we're not moving into a situation that is really happening, because that has also to be incentivized. So do you see any end of this impasse? Is it possible to break it?
It's possible, but it's going to be a challenge, which is why we're going to need to work collaboratively across traditional boundaries to do it. If I go back to Minister Singh's comments, it really just struck me the challenge of this, because on the one hand, he's right, completely right, about how disruptive this could be to economies that are already fragile in parts of the world where people are just emerging from poverty, or many still in poverty, and to take this on. And the flip side is that the failure to act aggressively and boldly in the short term will hurt those exact same populations and future generations probably the most severely, through disruption to food systems, through vulnerable populations in coastal areas or facing severe weather events, through just the flat out heat, because many of lower and middle income countries are just closer to the equator, and their citizens will suffer as heat rises to levels that probably most of us would think are barely livable. And so we're in this challenge where you can't help but feel empathy for the pressures that officials feel, government officials, and from their citizens. And we see it even in the developed world, as you were saying, people reacting to high energy prices, the yellow vest situation. So like, we have to start with empathy and understanding, but we also have to recognize that failure to act boldly puts enormous vulnerability under huge stretches of humanity, and often those who will least be able to react in effective ways to it. So what does that mean? That means first that we have to take it on as a global challenge, as I said earlier, where the developed world feels a responsibility to help low and middle income countries to move faster. Second, we have to realize that every single thing we do in technology to bring down the cost of this transition will pay for itself many times over, because one, it is extraordinarily expensive, and two, it'll change the trade-off curve for many others where this trade-off is enormously expensive. So all the investments we make in technology, whether it's in renewables, whether it's in carbon capture, whether it's in technologies that are out of favor like nuclear right now, but will maybe not in all parts of the world, but in some parts of the world will be an important part of the solution. And whether it's in all the work that the downstream users of carbon put into their supply chains to help them decarbonize, to pay and invest in their businesses to encourage that, those things are going to be very important. What I've been encouraged by is, I think the business community, in ways that George and Vicky expressed far better than I could, but on many different parts of the economy, are stepping forward to be bolder. I think many governments realize the urgency here, but they're under big challenges, a pandemic, not the least of that, for sure. And the more we can get cooperation between governments to set bolder ambitions, and business and government to work collaboratively to spur those investments, to protect the people that move first, to encourage changes in behavior from business, I think we're likely to get there at a better pace. And if we don't, the suffering is going to be very high.
No, thank you, Rich. George, maybe a short comment from you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Rich relative to technology innovation being a really big part of the solution. And what I'm seeing, especially in our space, that it does require more innovative approaches to how we go to market also, that the traditional ways that buildings were served and the cost and the lack of efficiency has really been highlighted now as we go through this cycle. And getting back to this public-private partnerships, we believe in, for instance, with buildings being such a big part of the carbon footprint, how do we be innovative in creating an output that, instead of the traditional approach to building and maintaining a building, how do you create an output that actually can be financed, and the output that's actually being created is creating a return as a result? And when we look at the tight economic conditions, whether it be public sector entities, including schools, hospitals, government agencies, they're stretched for for dollars to construct new facilities, maintain existing ones. And without the necessary resources, they're delayed, and then therefore it delays the ability to be able to get the efficiency that we believe can be achieved in buildings. And so the way that you look at the trillions in additional investment that's going to be needed in carbon cutting technology, and ultimately the projects and services that are going to be required to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Accord, we believe the smart regulations combined with technology and innovation, not only in the technology around renewables, but also as we're looking at the solution sets that are critical to being able to create the outputs within buildings, the two combined can ultimately not only create economic return, significantly reduce the carbon, and at the same time focusing the return on developing the workforce that we believe from an economic standpoint is going to be a big deal, especially in these developing communities.
Thank you, Josh. NK Singh, we know that Prime Minister Modi is heading to New York. He's going to participate at UNGA this year. He hasn't frequently gone, but this year he is. And I think he's also meeting with President Biden on Friday. And I guess one of the topics that you will touch on is COP26, energy, environment, but I guess also the broader picture about an inclusive recovery, and also the more geopolitical challenges that we are seeing just currently. So it would be very interesting, because I know you're very close to the Prime Minister, to hear a little bit of the current thinking and zeitgeist in Delhi now.
Well, I think that, first of all, I share most of the comments made by many of the panelists. I totally agree with the Excellency, the Finance Minister, that the innovative ways must be found, like the somewhat inclusive, broad-based SDR allocation, which doesn't leave out and exclude countries. And I think that getting multilaterals in the picture would be of enormous help. And I think that, Rich, as usual, I cannot refrain from making one observation, that I totally agree with you, Rich, when you say that this whole issue of disruption, and the issue of disruption in a country like India, pockets of fossil fuel where millions of people are engaged also happen to be the poorest part of the country. So a non-disruptive transition on fossil fuel, which minimizes human cost and doesn't accentuate the poverty syndrome, is one of the challenges which the leadership is having to grapple. I think that, Osha, you raised the issue of how do I see the Prime Minister's visit? Well, the Prime Minister knows very well the fact that he has gone on record so many times to emphasize what a centerpiece this issue is. Just take 3 recent announcements that is going to build on that. So that's partly will Bashir reflect. He chose the occasion of India's 75th independence to announce a special green hydrogen mission. That embeds a lot. A special green hydrogen mission. It'll encourage public outlay, it'll encourage garner private investment, it'll encourage gainful circles. So he's going to emphasize the global hydrogen alliance, green hydrogen alliance, as one of the areas building on his 75th Independence Day address. The second, as a signal of transiting, he did one of the critical users of fossil fuel in India, and is India's largest public sector undertaking, which has captive coal mines, which has lots of captive staff, is the Indian Railways, with which I don't know how many of this very distinguished panelists have traveled on the Indian Railways, but there are some good features of Indian Railways. He has openly committed to make the Indian Railways net zero. This is a very powerful signal that India's public sector undertakings, which will therefore naturally include steel, big investments there, it includes coal. If the most important public enterprise, which is railways, is going to be net zero, It's a target which seeks to extend his commitment in Paris of achieving certain levels while giving leadership to the Solar Alliance, to extend that in terms of energy efficiency and moving towards uses of greater technology. But the one point which I think that he's certainly going to emphasize, given what he has been saying, is the role of public-private partnership in harnessing affordable technology and making technology access. So I think that the criticality of the role of private capital and what is the kind of an enabling regulatory framework which are now crowding in of private capital is going to be one of the themes and messages. Yes, of course, I don't want to comment on it. Geopolitics will also be on his mind. But right now, given as we are under your moderatorship, shaping equitable, inclusive, sustainable growth, I have restricted my remarks on some of the issues which have been raised. One final comment, if I might. I think on issues of fiscal policy, and I think that the recovery process, if it is rapid enough, provides every country the room for much greater maneuverability on higher public outlays without compromising the framework of macroeconomic stability, to which levels of sustainable debt and levels of fiscal deficit are centerpiece of that strategy. Certainly that is true, but this is a time of not only transition from the pandemic, but a transition to an era of renewable energy. It's a time of fiscal forbearance and not fiscal rectitude. And therefore, the room for fiscal policy, sovereigns must view with flexibility, which the compelling needs of the time need.
Thank you so much, NK. Moving back to you, Mr. Jadan, we're coming close to an end here. You mentioned in your last intervention that we might not be faced with a V-shaped or a W-shaped recovery, but maybe a K. Something is going up and something is going down. Of course, that is concerning if what's going down is the developing economies and what's going up is the developed world. So then we will see increased inequalities in the world. But what would be very interesting, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but you have very smart economists around you there. Where do you feel that the economy are going to end up in 2 to 3 years? Are you bullish or bearish?
Thank you, Borge. I think two things. One is I am actually very optimistic. I think we will have generally a very good recovery over the next 2 or 3 years. I could tell you in Saudi Arabia, we are working very hard to complement our Vision 2030, and most likely the way things are working is we are going to have a very healthy recovery, and I think most of the world will have that. We need to watch out for low-income countries. We need to watch out for emerging markets that really requires help, and that should not be really ignored in any way, shape, or form. I think one thing that we talked about, and I would like just to comment on very quickly, possibly a few seconds, is if you look at some of the technologies that are now being applied, I'll tell you in Saudi Arabia, we have 2 investments, large investments that we are doing. One in government buildings, where we are actually contracting private sector to replace all the energy consuming tools, particularly lights, some of the ACs. And what we are paying them, we are not paying them anything. We are basically paying them part of the electricity bill, the difference between the 2 electricity bill before and after, for 5 years, some of them for 7 years. So it is just amazing what you could do when you have the will to apply technology and involve the private sector. The same we are doing with desal units, where we are replacing liquid fuel desal with either renewables or gas, and we are recovering the capital for replacing the whole unit in about 20 months. So if you think, and if you have the will, I think you have the means all over. Thank you.
Shukran. Short comment from you, Rich Lesser, and then I'll go for the closing. We should be on time. Rich.
Thank you. I just wanted to come back to Minister Singh's comments. I thought it was so important. This concept of a just transition. And what do we do at both the micro level? There's a very interesting effort I've been close to at the Council for Inclusive Capitalism with the Vatican about how to develop frameworks for companies to follow on just transitions, because we're all going to be changing our business models that could hurt workers, could hurt communities, could make it that much more difficult. And how do we, at that level, think about involving communities, involving our workforces, thinking about what other ways we can do to bridge this very challenging transition ahead. And second, how capital comes to bear on that. Bill Gates just announced a big program with Breakthrough Energies this morning that we'll be a part of on how do you invest capital with low return mindset, not to generate high returns, but to create the technologies that will help everyone, which I think Minister Singh also highlighted. And I just thought those 2 points were really important and worth amplifying.
Thank you so much. It's been a great panel. I learned a lot. I think we all gained insight. I would have loved to continue another half an hour. And then I learned that's the time when you should cut the panel, when everyone wants it to still continue. So really great input from all the panelists. We touched on energy access, energy security. We also touched on decoupling. We also touched on how we can secure a more inclusive and job-creating recovery. We didn't conclude if it was a W, K, or a V-shaped recovery, but I'm then leaning towards what Minister Jadaan said. He is optimistic on medium term that we will see growth back in the global economy. So thank you all for joining, and I couldn't think of a better start of our first day of our summit. So special thank you to a great panel. Thank you so much. See you soon.